GitHub. My name is Shawn. I also go by Swix on the internet, and we're talking about the open source monolith today. My subtitle or alternative title is Why We Need Maintainers.md. So this is a quote from a friend of mine, Pedro Nog, who is the maintainer of Docs, which is one of the major React ecosystem component libraries. It says, sorry, everybody, I failed. In order to develop Docs, I needed to wake up every day 3 hours earlier and go to bed 3 hours later. And he's a family man. Similarly, Ben Johnson from Lightstream, I do not wish to come off as anything but welcoming. However, I've made the decision to keep this project closed to contributions for my own mental health. Yeah, I mean, a little bit disturbing, but everyone's supportive. Sounds okay. Why I left my social accounts? For years, I work on open source projects, but sometimes that means to be exposed. I am no longer strong enough to receive free insults or sometimes threats like I did in 2019. Thomas Schneider. And then finally, Armin from Sentry is a maintainer of an open source library, but had extra burdens put on him because for whatever reason, his package became a critical package in the Python community. And then finally, this example from Chris from the CNCF, running a successful open source project is just goodwill hunting in reverse, where you start out as a respected genius and end up being a janitor who gets into fights. The central motivation of this talk is, does this sound like a sustainable open source culture, and what can we do about it? I think that's something that's worth discussing, and published a blog post with GitHub's README project, and I think they invited me here to share with you. The first thing to tackle is the biggest problem is funding. That is the first thing everyone says. If only we paid enough, then open source would be solved. And that's what a lot of people are working on. Patreon, Open Collective, GitHub sponsors. I think there's other donation-based organizations that I haven't included. Then there's also Gitcoin with bug bounties. And then there's also support and training businesses. All these are interesting models. Probably the most lucrative model is probably the VC approach, but also that has run into issues where what started as open source eventually either became closed source or got relicensed into something that's not strictly OSI approved. And ultimately, I think if you explore that in introspect, there's a few angles about this where I feel like the financial dimension isn't enough. So we'll go through a little bit of that. Money doesn't solve burnout. Only the high visibility stuff gets any attention and gets all the money. The low visibility stuff, the stuff that is critical or boring, actually gets the least amount of attention. Because the open source system is huge, how are we going to do that without any bias? If we're going to try to automate this, it's already a non-starter. Every single metric has been gamified to pieces, and there's no fair way to decide without human intervention. And then also allocation of funds by what metric, right? You can look at the number of contributors out there, equal weight all of them, but obviously some are going to be contributing a lot more than others. Here's a picture of one such example. Usually most projects have one super dedicated person and then people who just drop in and out. And then finally, even if you pay the best, like just from existing data, the top projects in the world are already well below market salary for that project. There's a generational dynamic that's often unspoken, which is essentially people come in to our industry and then they are asked to work on stuff for free. And it's usually the open source contract that burns out a lot of young people. And it's essentially a lot of richer, closed source people who are relying on the work of younger people trying to make it in our industry. And that's a very uncomfortable power dynamic over there. That's something that's kind of unsustainable and unspoken in our industry. So ultimately, what we need to figure out is what we call the open source contract. Typically, when people talk about the open source contract, they talk about the license, which is the legal contract. But here, I think what is underexplored, or what's sort of the question mark, is the social contract of open source. And that's something that's underdeveloped and clearly insufficient in terms of keeping the open source ecosystem going and open. I think the closest analogy I can bring is what we think about when we think about the developer full stack. All of us here as developers, we have a much more introspection into this industry than most other disciplines. As developers, we see a lot of differences. Here's a stack which I dreamed up, inspired by the OSI layer model, where it goes from firmware developers all the way to framework developers, language developers, cloud developers, and all the way up to low code and no code developers. All of these are different types of jobs requiring different kinds of skill sets. There's no expectation ever that we would be full stack in every single thing that's to do from human to machine. So that's something that we definitely want to see, which is why should open source maintainers be full stack? That is the real question that we're addressing here today. Can we break apart the stack? So before I go into my solution or my theories, I have to acknowledge the work that came before. And one of the more significant pieces of work comes from Nadia, previously of GitHub, who published this excellent book, Working in Public, where she identified 4 types of communities in open source, whether based on high user growth, low user growth, high contributor growth versus low contributor growth. A lot of the largest, highest dependency and low prestige, but a lot of emotional baggage projects do tend to be stadiums where there are a lot of users, but very low contributors. And that is the fundamental imbalance that concerns a lot of people, because those tend to be the very critical projects that don't get enough love. And so if you really break it out, you can sort of break out all the jobs to be done of maintainers. So it goes everything from issue triage to bug reproduction, PR review, user support, blah, blah, blah. User support is my favorite one, by the way, because people, when they're using your library, they actually don't know if there's a bug with the library or if the bug they're understanding. And you as the maintainer, you have to say, like, did you try this? Did you try that? Like, what's your operating system version? Did you use it with a compatible library? And often people won't read the docs, so then you have to do a lot of the work of support, which is a real job that people are paid for. All the way down in design, marketing, product management, blah blah blah, and then don't forget that you have to code as well, right? You started out with this open source library. Writing code, but then you ended up signing up for all this stuff as a result of the social contract of open source, and that's a really heavy expectation. So what I think we can do is we don't have to reinvent everything from scratch. I think in tech we have a tendency to have a not invented here syndrome for tech, but also not invented here syndrome for social contracts. We don't have to reinvent from first principles everything, because we have a lot of examples, right? Software is 180 years old, open source is 40 years old, but social contracts are 1,000 years old. Humanity has worked out a lot of ways over time. We're not perfect, but we've learned a lot of lessons, and maybe we could try looking outside of tech for fixing these social contract issues rather than looking inside of tech and trying to fix it with money. Some examples that inspire me are social clubs. This is maybe a little bit of an old school thing. No one does that anymore. I'm inspired by the yacht clubs and the social clubs of my past, where people serve. It's not perfect in its own way. There's a lot of politics. I'm sure there's diversity issues. I'm sure there's abuse issues. But those are one way in which you encourage people to serve for a limited term. Another way, it's government, very similar, but with formal legal power, where you have budget, your prestige, your service, all sorts of motivations that are not monetary related, but defines and well thought through forms of government. And essentially, that is a form of service to a community. And really, ultimately, you want to think about what drives people. That's ultimately what we're driving at, right? So status, power, impact, legacy, community, service, freedom, all the way at the bottom is money. If you're tempted to bring up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I would like to just share, people have actually modified the Maslow's hierarchy into a boat, where the top half is more about growth and positive development. The bottom half is about lack of downsides, mitigating your risks and having security. So I think that's a really good way to think about it. But really, you want to provide aspirational things that motivate people, because a lot of developers have their core needs secure. The three elements that I really think that we can steal: one, elections and fixed terms. There's no reason you should be a benevolent dictator for life if you just started an open source project. And because there is no BDFL, if there is no BDFL, then people with a stake in the projects can actually run for office and try to have some ownership, instead of saying, don't bother because there's BDFL, that's how things are, no, they'll never touch again, I won't even try. Give people hope, and they'll at least do something with it. Second, real budgets with public accountability. I'm not saying money is not part of the solution. Money is a part of the solution, but we need to balance it with audits and open meetings. Finally, separate responsibilities. That's probably the biggest proposal here, which is to split it up. Instead of one person being the full stack maintainer, splitting it up into different roles that we eventually define as a community, to limit expectations and increase the community. One of the resources I consulted was actually complaining about, I was just talking about how maintenance in open source can be a very lonely end, because there's just not enough community around it. Basically, encouraging maintainers as well to say, like, there are these defined roles. We set these norms. There's always a place for people who want to step up in a limited way. And defining that limited way is the bulk of the community work that we're doing here. How do we do this? We're going to get into human files. What are human files? Glad you asked. So, short history of human files. 2012, 10 years ago, we had contributing.md, also pioneered by GitHub, which is fantastic. And then codeowners.md 5 years later, architecture.md. All these are ways in which we document our code for humans, just like write code for machines. 2016, outside of code human files, in 2016, we also had the all contributors standard come along, which is essentially a bot and a standard recognizing 33 different kinds of contributions. A little bit too many for my taste, because there's just too many to keep in your head. But then in 2019, one of the interesting things was that one of these roles was built into GitHub. And this is a GitHub feature that is still not super well known. I have to tell people about it, where you can actually offer triage and maintain roles that are not admin, they're not read-write, to contributors, right? It's a special status. The problem is GitHub doesn't do enough yet to promote this, so it's probably not very well used because most people don't know about it. So that's the short history of human files. And really, what I think could be something that we do going forward is maybe some kind of maintainers.md. The file actually doesn't matter. It's I'm not like, I don't want you to overly focus on the file. It's more about the separation of concerns of maintainers, right? Having a tech lead, documentarian, issue, and PR triage, community builder, project manager, user research, quality assurance. There's a lot of essentially informal roles that people could pick up with limited terms, right? I think the limited terms thing is the most important part of this design, because you want people to have the opportunity to step up. You want people who are running things to have an end date where they can move on to other responsibilities. And I think that is a very healthy and maybe self-sustaining thing. But we do have to build some momentum around it. This is just a proposal. It's not in practice in any place just yet. But I do think that there's some potential behind this, because we need to borrow ideas and try to fix the social contract of open source. One pattern which I think there's a strong amount of validation already is developers like having memberships as a badge of honor. People who go through Y Combinator will list their Y Combinator cohort. Similarly, if you have a social club, or if you have a term of service in government or in the military, you'll talk about the tours you did. You talk about the service that you did. And I think that is something aspirational that we could build for open source. At the company where I work, we also build and maintain a maintainer and contributor program. We're running one right now for Hacktoberfest. By the time you see this in November, it'll be over, but we're constantly trying to encourage and define clear roles for maintainers and contributors to participate in company-sponsored open source as well. And then finally, open source projects die, and I think we need to acknowledge that and maybe have a healthy renewal process or archival. Recent examples are YouTube DL and Storybook, both of which technically died, but then were also revived by their community. Highly encouraging examples of open source projects which have basically transitions in community ownership that was subsequently very well managed for their user base. And that's really it. That's a proposal for breaking apart the open source monolith. Thank you for having me.